Hi, Jeffrey here. So this is a time-lapse video with my commentary on my drawing of the building Cologne Cathedral. I start by drawing a rough outline based on a reference image that I use. After that, I start to draw in the detail from the top left corner. The reason why I start there is so that my hand doesn't smudge the colors below on the paper. When I start a drawing, I always think about where to start to prevent my hand from being over the color pencil that I've drawn so it doesn't smudge. Anyways, here I am drawing a spire. I look back and forth between my reference image and my drawing, and I draw each pixel of color I see on my computer screen. If I can't see the colors closely enough, I'll zoom in on my reference image until I can. Sometimes I don't have an exact color pencil that's close to the color on my reference image. If that happens, I'll mix 1, 2, or even 3 color pencils together to create the color that's most similar. One tricky thing about this drawing where it's currently showing is that this building has a lot of scaffolding. However, I would like to draw what it looks like without scaffolding. In order to do that, I have to use a little bit of imagination. I look at areas of the building that have similar structure without scaffolding and draw my closest approximation of what I think it would look like based on that. Once I reach the scaffolding on the left tower, I stop and start drawing the right tower. The reason I do this is because the right tower has less scaffolding. Therefore, if I draw the right tower roof in its entirety, I can then use that to inform how to draw the left tower areas that have scaffolding on them. To make sure I don't miss any detail, I draw from the top to the bottom line by line, or row by row. To make sure the drawing stays aligned, each row I draw, I use a ruler to draw a straight horizontal line at the bottom of the next row that I draw. I then fill in the detail between the above portion that I've drawn and the horizontal line below. After I've drawn enough of this spire, I then draw the elements between the two spires. This area is especially tricky because I couldn't find any photos showing what the elements in this area look like. So I use my imagination. I assume each spire is symmetrical onto itself, and try my best to draw the parts that are covered with scaffolding to look like the parts that are not covered with scaffolding. The building has some repetition, so I can use this to my advantage. There are certain repeating patterns, and some of the patterns are not covered with scaffolding, so based on that, in the same location, I can imply what it looks like without scaffolding in the locations that have it. I make sure to not miss any pixels, as those are what give it that detailed look. The more pixels I draw without dimensioning, the larger the margin of error. Therefore, if I've drawn a while without measuring, I then have to measure again to make sure I'm on track with the reference image I'm using. Depending on the arrangement of elements, I might draw line by line, row by row, or column by column, either up to down or left to right. How I decide which to do depends on the circumstances of the elements. Sometimes the details are very tight and close together. In those cases, I have to really smush the details. Drawing every pixel means that some days, if I stop for the day, the next day I forget or can't find where I stopped. If that happens, I zoom all the way out on my reference image and then slowly zoom back in. Another thing I do sometimes to help me locate where I am is put my mouse cursor in the area that I'm supposed to be drawing. Sometimes I also have to mix colors because one color pencil does not exactly match the color on the reference image enough. Sometimes there are individual pixels that are different colors than the surrounding pixels by a lot, such as a black dot surrounded by a bunch of blue. I use these dots as well to help me locate where I am because they are more distinguishable from what's around them. Another strategy I use is I draw around an area that I later color in. This helps me keep the proportions more in line with the way they should be. Depending on how similar in color areas of pixels are, some areas are harder to follow with my eyes than others. If two pixels are slightly different colors, but still close enough to one another that they don't warrant using another color pencil, then I'll just use the same color pencil and just shade lighter or darker to make the distinction between the two. In this area I'm drawing, the colors are all kind of similar to each other, and this makes it harder to distinguish with your eye where you are and not get lost. I tend to find that lighter color pencils are harder to distinguish the colors between each other than darker colors. Sometimes it takes me about a minute or more to reorient myself and find where I am in the reference image. What makes this drawing especially tricky is the angle at which the image is. It's not straight on in front, instead, it's on a diagonal. This means I can't simply replicate how I draw one tower to another. The towers are also asymmetrical because they have different scaffolding in different places. Drawing every pixel is similar to drawing a point cloud. It is as if I'm a 3D scanner and every dot I draw is the laser, with points bouncing off. Some parts of my reference image are crisp and clear, while other parts appear more blurry. I try to minimize the amount of the drawing that I make up, so I draw the blurriness accordingly based on the reference image. For the parts that are blurrier, I don't have to sharpen my pencil as much. The reason why I draw line by line like a printer is because that's the best way to capture all the detail. Which is ironic because normally you would consider that to be counter-efficient. One thing I struggle with when drawing each pixel is that sometimes I can't fit as much of the pixels into the space as I see in my reference image. In those scenarios, I just sharpen my pencil as sharp as possible and try my best. Sometimes I also feel like my perception of the colors that I see in the reference image change. Or maybe the color I'm looking at is somewhere between the color of two colored pencils that I have. And the reason why I don't draw a more in-depth outline is because I'm trying to save time. Which is ironic considering normally drawing an outline saves time rather than takes up time. At this point in the process, I start to become concerned with how long it's taking. I try to think of various different ways to speed up the process. One of these methods involves moving my cursor on the screen every few pixels. However, unlike the pixels in the reference image, the pixel that I try to represent with my color pencil is not guaranteed to always be the same size. Thus, I have to compensate for this difference by constantly checking with my reference image. At this point, I notice that the building has a bunch of straight lines, and so I use them as references. Sometimes the straight lines have protrusions, and sometimes they kind of wrap around and form shapes. It's difficult to make sure pixels align with each other horizontally. Very rarely are pixels that are adjacent to one another of the same color. At this point, I completed drawing the front facade of the building, and that took 595 hours. Now I start to draw the rest of the building that is behind. I try to think of different techniques to save time, one of which is to color in the darkest areas of a region first. Sometimes it helps to draw around something and then fill it in later. It's good to note that I tend to draw the pixels larger than they should be. At this point, I try experimenting with coloring multiple pixels of the same color before switching between pencils. I also start to notice some patterns in the colors of the pixels. I try to find ways to standardize and streamline things. One method that I try is to visualize the reference image being divided into squares. And when I say squares, I mean squares composed of multiple pixels. And I try to find the squares with the most contrast, the lightest lights and the darkest darks. I also center my mouse on these areas. Every single pixel makes a difference. Every time I draw, I increase the chance of the margin of error. Also, I draw in portions depending upon how much I can see on my screen of the reference image. However, I position the image such that there is some overlap between the previous portion and the current portion I'm drawing. I am at the point where scaffolding is blocking portions of the building in the reference image. So in those places, I have to kind of make up what it looks like because it's not shown. If colors are placed too close to one another, then they'll mix together. At this point, I'm trying to draw an exterior inside corner, but it's hard to find a reference image. So I kind of deduce what it looks like based on other areas. Sometimes it's hard to tell what should be in front and what should be behind. And in those cases, I use multiple other reference images and try to synthesize what it should look like. There's a portion that's covered by scaffolding, so in order to understand what it looks like, I first have to draw the portion near. I then realize that color makes it more accurate, while lines make it more precise. Some colored pencil colors align more with the colors of the pixels than others. I try to find ways to keep track of where I stop and start each time I do a drawing session. One way I do this is by drawing the boundaries of rectangles. Then I fill in those rectangles. So now I try to modularize the drawing process. This allows for more consistency and also accuracy. Although I draw in equal-sized chunks, the complexity of the pixels in each varies. So the exact order and method I use to draw each chunk is slightly different. In this area there's a lot of overlap, so it's hard to discern what should be where. Then I try to make the chunks larger so I don't have to adjust them as often. But because they have become somewhat large, I begin to subdivide them. I sharpen my pencils more to be able to squeeze into the spaces. Drawing the pixels along the very edges of the building can be more tricky because they don't fit into the number of pixels in the squares in the middle. And I've about completed the drawing here. The total time is about 1240 hours. And here are some side-by-side images comparing my drawing to the reference image I used. These images also show how much I zoomed in on my computer screen to draw each pixel. Thank you for watching. If you would like to support me and my art, you can order prints of my drawing online at etsy.com/shop/JeffreyShuArt. The link to that is in the description of this video. And like and subscribe if you enjoy my content. Thank you so much. Have a great day.